So what are the biggest national security threats facing Canada right now, and are we equipped to handle them? With me is Outgoing National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Jody Thomas. Hi, Ms. Thomas. Good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you making the time just a few hours before you end your time as National Security Advisor. I wanted to start off on the topic of the invocation of the Emergencies Act and the federal court's decision this week. Part of what the judge took issue with was whether or not what was going on met the bar of a threat to national security. You were advising the government during the time that they invoked that act. Why did you specifically feel it did meet that bar?
So I think, as I said in my poke testimony, what we were seeing in terms of activity on the ground and intelligence was very clear. There was a huge occupation here in Ottawa. It was increasingly violent. We were starting to hear language about weapons being in the trucks. We had the arrest in Coutts, which was a significant weapons cache and very concerning. The charges that have been laid there are indicative of what was going on and what was being planned. And we were seeing daily pop-ups of, we're going to occupy this, we're going to occupy that. Bridges, rail lines, more people moving across the country, east and west, to converge on Ottawa and Toronto. In our view, it was national in scope. It was growing, and we had to take action to end it. There was an economic threat to Canada. There was a security threat to Canada. There was a reputational threat to Canada. But what we didn't know was as concerning as what we did know, and we knew a lot.
And what do you mean by that?
We knew a lot about what the plans were, that these people were going to stay. There was the whole group of people who thought they were going to overthrow the government. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen, but they were here to stay, and they were using intimidation and violence and threat to ensure that the occupation persisted. And we were seeing increasingly what we would call radicalized language from people about, we're going to kill, we'll do whatever we need to do. And the connectiveness or the inspiration that the pop-ups were getting from what was going on in Ottawa left us very concerned for the national stability. And economic security is national security. National security is economic security. People couldn't work, people couldn't go to work, people couldn't walk the streets, people couldn't cross bridges. The economy was being affected in the auto industry. Those things are significant.
The judge seemed to indicate that his thinking was, in hindsight, the kinds of things you described could have been dealt with, A, by lower levels of government, or B, more specifically, by other levels of law enforcement. Do you think if it had been, invoking the act would have been necessary?
If it had been, we wouldn't have been in the situation we were in, but it wasn't. And so hindsight is 2020, and retrospectives about would've, should've, could've, sure. But the reality in the moment was that municipalities and provinces were struggling to deal with what was going on.
Do you, in hindsight, have anything that you think you would have done differently or that the government could have done differently? In
terms of my own personal approach, I was 3 weeks in my job. I could have and should have perhaps, and maybe in a different circumstance, consulted differently with various levels of government and policing. But I think in the moment, with what we knew, where we were, I'm confident with the action that I took and the advice that I gave.
Do you think a convoy like the one that was here could occupy, for example, downtown Ottawa again? Like, what do you think, based on the domestic threat environment, is the likelihood of something like that happening again?
I think the threat of it is constant, and we're seeing a new convoy being planned to occupy police stations. There was a lot of media about that a couple of days ago. We certainly saw some intelligence on it. I think that the understanding of how to respond is completely different, and nobody's going to take them lightly any longer.
Does that mean, in your view, that the likelihood of having to invoke the Emergencies Act has decreased?
Certainly for this kind of event, yes.
Okay. There's also another big event coming on that was part of what transpired while you occupied the position, and that is the start of the foreign interference inquiry. Some of the genesis of that inquiry is based on reporting about who knew what when, how information flowed, and in particular, for example, someone like Michael Chong allegedly being targeted, and that information not getting where it should have gone. There were new directives issued in light of that. If someone like Michael Chong or another MP is targeted in the future, do you think there's any way they wouldn't find out?
I think there's almost no way they wouldn't find out. Between the information that we provide to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister, the clerk, the ministerial directive that was given to public safety and ceases by the public safety minister, the process is to ensure that individuals, MPs who are targeted by foreign countries, they will be informed, and we will assist them with understanding whatever the situation and the scenario means. I think that the Michael Chong situation was really unfortunate. He's been very good about working with us to understand it. And I think that the level of collaboration, cooperation, process, it's improved significantly.
What do you say to Canadians who watched that unfold and felt like, or were left with the impression that everybody's acting in silos to the detriment of national security? Do you think that that is an accurate impression to be left with, and how would you respond to it?
So there are silos, bureaucracies are large and silos happen. But I don't think it's to the detriment of national security. When there's actionable intelligence, I can say without question, the national security agencies and departments come together and the Prime Minister is informed and his team is informed. The ministers are informed. And then action is taken. And there are examples of when we've seen actionable intelligence and the Prime Minister has directed the agencies, departments to execute plans. This was a piece where Michael Chong was concerned. It was a piece that I think that people read and should have briefed him on. But it wasn't okay, RCMP, you need to go arrest somebody. It wasn't the Department of National Defense, you need to go do something. And so those gray pieces of intelligence, for lack of a better term, are now, I think, treated differently.
Part of what the interference inquiry is going to look at is the allegations against China. I was reading some articles written when you were appointed in which you were described as a quote-unquote China hawk. Would you assess the threat China poses to the West, or even to Canada specifically, to be greater or less than where it was when you assumed this position?
I think China has been absolutely consistent in its behavior. They have the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a checklist of what they're going to do and where they want to position China. And I think the Chinese president has been very clear about what his vision is for China. And so I think it's absolutely the same. I think that we are able to differently deal with threats from China.
How so?
Well, number one, the two Michaels have been freed. And so that affected our relationship. And I believe and I agree that getting the two Michaels freed had to be the priority. We now have the Indo-Pacific strategy. Minister Jolie just had a conversation with her counterpart in China, and I think that our relationships are becoming more like the American and maybe the British relationships with China, where you understand you have to have a trade relationship, a foreign policy, diplomatic relationship with one of the world's largest economies, but you have to do it on our terms and with our eyes wide open. Canada is a country rich in resources. Canada is a country that a lot of countries would like to invest in: critical minerals, mines, hydrocarbons. Our responsibility to manage that for the benefit of Canadians.
You mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy. Part of that strategy is, and this is the same in the U.S., amplifying a relationship with India in order to counter the threat that China poses. It's become a bit tricky, as you are well aware, to do that with India because of the allegations that have come to light that they were involved in the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. My understanding is that you have made multiple trips to India. What is your impression about why they are not cooperating?
I wouldn't describe them as not cooperating.
You would not?
No, I think we've made advancements in that relationship. And they understand what we believe happened. The RCMP investigation is well underway, and so I can't speak too much about it, and the RCMP will hopefully be able to prosecute the individuals accountable and responsible. But my discussions with my counterpart in India have been fruitful. and I think they've moved things forward.
Is that an evolution? Because the government at the outset of all of this was saying that India was not cooperating.
It's very much an evolution.
Is that an evolution spurred on by what transpired in the United States?
I think the two are connected for sure. And the U.S. judicial system is different than ours. They unseal indictments in a way we don't, and they were investigating a conspiracy and we're investigating a murder, and theirs was a little more advanced than ours. So the information that they revealed supported our position and our assertions with India, and India is working with us, my counterpart in particular, far more closely to resolve this. We think it's important that we resolve what happened to a Canadian citizen, but we have to have people-to-people ties. We have a huge diaspora. Again, we have to have a trade relationship. Our ability to function in the Indo-Pacific does rely on having a healthy relationship with India. And I think that we are working back towards that.
Did you advise the Prime Minister to make the accusation public?
When asked if it would affect the investigation, my answer was no. I thought that we've never had an extrajudicial killing of this nature in Canadian soil. When a media outlet had the story, I think it's important that the Prime Minister speak to things.
Was that the genesis, essentially, to go public because it would have been public otherwise?
That's my understanding, yes. The Prime Minister certainly wanted to protect the RCMP investigation for as long as possible.
The threat environment to Canada is of great concern to Canadians, and often you'll hear various people in your position or elsewhere asked on Parliament Hill, what do you view as the biggest threat? I guess it's in that vein that I wonder, if you were to continue in this job, what would keep you up at night?
So there are a lot of threats. We worry about the kinetic threat. We worry about the military threat. We worry about domestic threats, radicalized youth, organized crime. But what worries me for the long term, because it's going to be pervasive and it's difficult to counter, is mis and disinformation. It is working at epic size and speed. The ability for those who want to do harm to deliberately mislead, to create stories, to amplify stories. When most people are getting their news online in a way that we didn't see generations ago, you get fed. We talk about echo chambers in our world. You get fed the information that confirms what you already believe. And it doesn't matter if it's accurate or not. It doesn't matter if somebody has planted a story deliberately to cause you to go down rabbit holes. And I think it's going to be a huge problem.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Ms. Thomas, thank you so much. Congrats on your retirement.
Thank you.